Presenting the new Rad Dog Data Center from me.
This is the current craze game, Pac-Man.
It's the all-new CFS 250.
They were once the heartbeat of your childhood. Now they're buried beneath decades of dust and digital noise, like toys left behind in a house that no longer remembers you. What happened to the world we built from neon, noise, and scraped knees? And why did we let it all disappear? There was something sacred about Saturday mornings in the 1980s, something that felt like a reward for surviving the school week. You would roll out of bed in your pajamas, maybe still half asleep, and plant yourself in front of the television with a bowl of cereal so sweet it practically glowed. There was no need to scroll, no remote to click endlessly. You knew exactly what was coming. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the Smurfs, Thundercats, and more. But the real show was in the spaces between. Commercials shouted over each other with neon mascots and cartoon jingles, trying to convince you that this sugary box of marshmallows was not just breakfast, but your ticket to happiness. It was a hypnotic ritual. Cereal in hand, eyes locked on the screen, the house still quiet except for the television. And when the toy ads came on, everything paused. You would stare, memorize, and plan your next desperate plea to mom and dad. It was not just television, it was childhood conditioning. But somewhere along the line, Saturday mornings stopped mattering. The cereal mascots disappeared. The cartoons lost their time slot. And the world never really noticed. But you did. You just forgot. Until now. Because before we streamed everything, we waited for it. And it was worth it. Just like what came next in your backpack. Loud, bright, and Velcro loud on purpose. It was the sound that echoed through every classroom hallway. Reap! The sound of a trapper keeper flap being opened in one violent motion like a magician revealing a trick. These were not just school supplies. These were badges of identity. Whether yours had a geometric neon triangle design or a Lisa Frank dolphin flying through outer space, it said everything about who you were, or at least who you wanted to be. It had pockets that barely held together, paper that never stayed in its rings, and plastic covers that warped in the sun. And it was perfect. Everyone had their method. Some kids had the calendar planner filled out like a Wall Street broker. Others used the plastic sleeve to hide secret notes, torn comic strips, or detention slips they forgot to give their parents. But more than anything, it was yours. You picked it out. You zipped it closed. You carried it like a suitcase filled with dreams. And then one day, they were banned. Teachers called them distractions. Schools claimed they were too noisy. And just like that, they vanished. But if you ever hear that unmistakable rip in your memory, you will know. That was not just plastic. That was personality. And what filled it was just as strange, just as vivid, and just as forgotten. Like the time your notebook smelled like pepperoni, root beer, or worse. You did not earn scratch and sniff stickers. You survived for them. They were tiny, circular, and usually smelled like something familiar, but just a little off. Root beer that smelled too sweet. Pizza that somehow had a hint of crayon. And then, of course, the mysterious ones labeled yuck or gross that every kid lined up to sniff, gag, and laugh at. Teachers kept them in secret drawers like treasures. You never saw them hand one out casually. No, these were rewards for a perfect spelling test, a cleaned desk, or just being quiet when the class got loud. You would stick them onto your folder or your pencil case and guard them like gold. Some kids had entire sticker books dedicated to collecting and trading them. And yes, there were rules. No scratching too hard. No peeling it off someone else's desk. No faking a smell just to fit in. It sounds silly now, but back then, it was currency. A root beer sticker meant you were doing something right. A mystery stink meant you had status. They faded over time. The smells wore off. The adhesive dried up. But even now, if someone mentions scratch and sniff, you know exactly what they are talking about. And that memory is still sharp. Like the clang of something else you carried proudly in your hands, covered in cartoon heroes heavy as a brick and always leaking tomato soup. Metal lunchboxes were not just about food. They were about identity. You could walk into the cafeteria and know exactly who someone was based on what they carried. E.T., Strawberry Shortcake, The A-Team, Knight Rider. These lunchboxes were loud, colorful, and always had a matching thermos inside that smelled like forgotten spaghetti by lunchtime. They would dent within a week, chip their paint after one drop, and clatter so loudly on the table it turned heads. The thermos lid doubled as a cup. The soup inside never stayed hot. And if your sandwich was packed next to a leaky pudding cup, you were in for a lunchtime surprise. Still, they were magic. Opening one was like unlocking your own personal vending machine. Even if all you had was a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple, it felt like more, because it was yours. You would trade parts of your lunch based on the power of your box. A Transformers box? That gave you leverage. A generic one? Not so much. Over time, plastic replaced the metal. Characters faded, designs got cheaper. And today, most kids eat out of brown paper bags or insulated packs with no soul. But once upon a time, what you brought to lunch said everything about you. And what you wore on the way there? That said even more. Fashion in the 1980s did not whisper, it screamed. On your feet were jellies, those translucent plastic shoes that felt like walking on rubber bands and smelled like a new toy aisle. On your shirts, colors that changed with your body heat. Hypercolor magic that turned purple when you sweated in gym class or clashed wildly with everything else you were wearing. And on your sneakers, Velcro. Lots and lots of Velcro. Not because you could not tie laces, but because Velcro was cool. It snapped open. It snapped shut. It made noise when you moved. These were not just trends. They were signals. You were part of the world now. You were growing up. Even if your jellies gave you blisters. Even if your shirt never changed back to blue. You wore it anyway because it made you feel like part of something big and bright and new. But somewhere in the closet of your memory, these styles got boxed up and left behind. They do not show up in vintage shops. They do not make sense on paper. But you remember them. You felt them. And sometimes, you wish you could wear them again. Just to feel that wild, fearless energy. The kind you had when even dinner felt like a science experiment in metal trays with tiny compartments and a brownie that burned your tongue. Dinner used to come in a foil tray, divided like a tiny apartment. Meat in one corner, peas in another, and a brownie that either scorched your mouth or stayed frozen in the middle. TV dinners were not gourmet, but they were futuristic. You would peel back the foil, pop it in the microwave, and wait. That hum meant convenience, progress, and independence. It was not just about saving time. It was about having your own meal, your own space, your own show to eat in front of. Salisbury steak swimming in salty brown sauce, mashed potatoes with a swirl that never mixed right, peas that tasted like metal but looked bright green enough to fool you, and the brownie, always, always the brownie. It was a meal designed by science and nostalgia, all wrapped up in tin. Somewhere along the way, microwaves got faster, portions got smaller, and we traded sections for squeeze pouches. But the memory of that shiny tray, pulled hot from the microwave and placed carefully on a plastic tray table, never really left. Just like the jewelry you wore to dinner that clicked, clacked, and told your whole personality one charm at a time. Pop beads were not jewelry. They were a sound, a game, and a statement. You snapped them together with a satisfying click, strung them around your neck, and pulled them apart just to do it all over again. Every kid had a handful of these plastic links, shiny, pastel-colored beads that turned any boring afternoon into a full-blown runway. They popped apart as easily as they connected, so they were never permanent. But that was the fun of it. You were constantly remaking them, reshaping them, changing who you were from hour to hour. And if you graduated from pop beads, you moved on to charm necklaces. Long chains covered in dangling trinkets, tiny telephones, shoes, hair dryers, or soda cans. They jingled when you walked, got tangled in your hair, and made you feel like the coolest kid in the cafeteria. They did not match your outfit. That was never the point. They were chaotic, personal, and loud. The kind of loud you were proud of. Today, jewelry is sleek and serious. But back then, it was fun. It was play. And it told a story with every piece. Kind of like the clunky pixels and beeping soundtrack of the very first video games, where a single joystick took you everywhere and nowhere. Atari was not just a console. It was the moment you realized you could control what was on the screen. That beige plastic box with its wood-grain front was a rite of passage. You plugged in a cartridge, held a joystick with one red button, and disappeared into a world of blocky spaceships and endless beeping, Pong, Centipede, adventure. But nothing haunted us quite like the E.T. game. A confusing labyrinth of pits, pixels, and frustration. It was one of the first times we learned that not every game had a happy ending. We still tried, over and over, because we believed it should make sense. The magic of Atari was not in how good the games were. It was how new it all felt. How unreal it was to be the one moving the little guy on the screen. Kids today boot up hyper-realistic games in seconds. But back then, we waited for the television to warm up, adjusted the antenna, and prayed for no static. You only had one game at a time, and that was enough. Just like how every living room had one couch, always covered in a thick plastic shell that crinkled when you sat down, like it was protecting something too precious to ever be touched. The plastic furniture cover was not furniture. It was armor. It protected the nice couch, the one you were not really supposed to sit on even though it was right there in the middle of the room. It squeaked. It stuck to the backs of your legs. It reflected the sunlight in weird ways, but it was a constant. Grandma's house had it. So did your neighbors. And no one really questioned it. The plastic was thick, yellowing at the edges, sometimes floral patterned like a raincoat. It kept the fabric clean, free of dust, spills, and children. It made summer unbearable, winter cold, and every visit oddly formal. You would slide around on it, your shorts fusing to the plastic as you shifted in place. You were always one squeak away from being told to sit still. It was not meant for comfort. It was meant for preservation. That couch was a relic, and the plastic made sure it stayed that way. Today, furniture is made to be lived in. Back then, it was made to be kept pristine forever. And if you ever dared to lie down and flip through channels for too long, there was only one tool to help you keep track of what came next, sitting proudly on the coffee table, creased, circled, and sacred. The TV guide was the roadmap of your week. Thin paper, tiny fonts, glossy covers with sitcom stars you idolized. Before streaming, before on demand, there was planning. You circled the shows you could not miss. You dog-eared pages. You fought with siblings over who got the remote when your favorites overlapped. It was a ritual. You would sit down with a pen and the TV guide while your parents argued about what night Dallas was on. Inside were ads for made-for-television movies, cartoon lineups, and those mysterious late-night listings you were not allowed to watch. There was no scrolling, no instant gratification. If you missed something, you missed it. And if you remembered to tape it, well, that was elite status. The TV guide made television feel important. It gave structure to chaos. Now, everything is available all the time, and somehow it means less. Back then, the wait made it matter. Just like how fast food used to feel like a treat, especially when it came with a surprise tucked into a bright plastic pumpkin or a Muppet-shaped toy that you never let go of. There was a time when a trip to McDonald's felt like a miniature holiday. Not because of the burgers or fries, but because of what came with them. Plastic pails shaped like pumpkins, ghosts, or witches that doubled as trick-or-treat buckets and instantly became treasures. Kids carried them around like trophies. They were not just seasonal giveaways. They were Halloween itself. And then there were the Fraggle Rock toys, little plastic Muppets with big hair and tiny accessories jammed into every car cup holder or buried in the back seat like forgotten friends. These toys lived full lives. They went to the park, the grocery store, the doctor's office. Their paint chipped, their arms broke, and still, you refused to throw them away. Fast food tie-ins were not mass-produced landfill bait. They were magic in a cardboard box. And if you were lucky enough to collect the whole set, that was bragging rights for weeks. Now, Happy Meals come with QR codes and lifeless plastic, but back then, they felt alive. And the kids who played with them? They were a walking fashion explosion. Every color, every scent, every can of Aquanet fueling a look that defied gravity and good sense. Hair in the 1980s was not about subtlety. It was about volume. The bigger, the better. Girls spent hours teasing their bangs to towering heights, spraying layer after layer of Aquanet until it could deflect a light breeze or a brick. Boys rocked mullets, short in the front and long in the back, as if undecided between rebellion and respectability. And in every bathroom across America, there was the smell of chemicals, the click of banana clips, and the sound of someone blow-drying their future. These banana clips snapped open like jaws and clamped down on ponytails like traps, creating a look that said, "Yes, I am absolutely in charge of this hallway." It was a time when looking ridiculous was the goal. Hairspray cans were as essential as lunch money. Your hair was a sculpture, a protest, a declaration. And when you walked into school, you prayed it survived the bus ride. Today's sleek and effortless styles have nothing on the crunchy, rigid chaos of 1980s hair. Because back then, beauty was about commitment, and committing meant shellacking your head into a helmet. But when it came to dreaming, nothing held more power than a book so big it made your arms tired to lift it. The Sears Wish Book was not a catalog. It was a portal. Every December, it landed on the doorstep like a sacred text, and kids across the country dove into its glossy pages with pens in hand and dreams in their hearts. You would flip through slowly, page by page, circling the remote control cars, Barbie dream houses, Lionel train sets, and whatever else made your little heart race. You were not just shopping, you were manifesting, folding corners, making lists, hoping someone somewhere was paying attention. The Sears catalog was heavy enough to hurt someone and somehow still never felt big enough. It held everything from bicycles to slippers, toy ovens to typewriters. Parents would roll their eyes. "We are just looking," they said. But looking felt like owning, just for a minute. And when it disappeared after the holidays, it was like the season ended all over again. You never knew how much you cared until you missed it, because it was not about the gifts. It was about the possibility, the dreaming. And for some of us, the soundtrack to those dreams came not from Spotify or YouTube, but from a cassette you recorded, one awkward, glorious song at a time. There was nothing like hovering over the record button, finger poised, radio blaring, just waiting for your favorite song to start. And when it finally did, you hit it, record. But the DJ kept talking over the intro, or the first lyric got clipped, or your little brother shouted in the background, and you did not care. Because this was your mixtape. A Frankenstein creation of love songs, power ballads, and one weird polka track you could not bring yourself to delete. You labeled the cassette with a Sharpie, stuck it into your Walkman, and listened to it until the tape got thin. Making mixtapes off the radio was not just a hobby. It was a test of patience, a skill, an art form. You timed it perfectly. You rewound and re-recorded and whispered shh, like it was sacred. There was a pride in hearing your playlist come to life, your soundtrack, your vibe, your world. Kids today will never understand the emotional damage of taping over your best song by accident, or how it felt to hand a crush a mixtape like a secret handshake. But that was the 80s. Everything took work. Everything felt personal. Even the playgrounds, where danger was real, the sun was hot, and every slide felt like a dare. The playgrounds of the 1980s were built for survival, not safety. No rubber mats, no soft foam barriers, just towering metal slides that baked under the sun like griddles and sent you flying down faster than gravity should allow. You would hit the bottom with a thud, burn on your thighs, maybe a mouthful of sand, and still run back up for another turn. There were seesaws that could launch you into orbit. Jungle gyms made of metal pipes, rusted and crooked but proud. And of course the wood chips, jagged, splinter-filled missiles just waiting to wedge themselves into your socks. If you were really lucky, your park had those giant black tire things. No one ever knew what they were for. You climbed on them anyway, because it was not about safety. It was about risk, triumph, falling and getting back up before your parents noticed. It was not reckless. It was normal. And in a world before phones and constant connection, that scraped knee was your notification badge. It meant you were alive. It meant you were part of something. And when it was time to go home, you had one last task: find a payphone, drop a quarter, and remember the number without a screen to help you. You never knew how much a quarter mattered until you were stranded outside a movie theater, freezing, staring at a payphone that smelled like pennies and bubble gum. Back then, calling someone meant memorizing the number or writing it down on your hand in smeared ink. There were no contacts to scroll through, no redial button to save you, just a metal box, a coiled cord, and the constant fear of hearing that soul-crushing, "Please deposit 25 cents." You rehearsed numbers in your head like they were family secrets. You called collect when you got to a friend's house. You prayed someone would pick up, especially if you were out past curfew. And if the line was busy, that was it. Game over. Try again later. Somehow it worked. The whole system was a gamble, but it gave you just enough connection to feel safe and just enough space to feel free. Today, we carry our lives in our pockets, but back then, a payphone was a lifeline. And recess was ruled by a different kind of madness, one filled with slapping metal, mutant cards, and the holy chaos of the pog table. Slap bracelets were banned in schools for a reason, and the reason was not safety, it was distraction. These thin metal bands wrapped in colorful fabric were weapons of fun. You would stretch one flat across your palm, line it up like a bullwhip, and snap, instantly curled around your wrist with a sound that could silence a room. It felt like a magic trick. Every kid had at least one. Most had a dozen, hidden up sleeves or swapped like currency at lunch. And just when slap bracelets were peaking, garbage pail kids took over. Gross, hilarious, and brilliantly wrong, these trading cards were the anti-Barbie. Names like Barf and Barbara or Snotty Scotty turned stomachs and started playground revolutions. Teachers hated them, parents banned them, kids loved them. Then came pogs, milk caps transformed into battlegrounds. You stacked them, slammed them, and argued endlessly about the rules. It was not about the toy. It was about the moment. The feeling of knowing that for just 1 week, you had the thing everyone else wanted. Then it was gone. On to the next. Like the mysterious ads that showed up in magazines offering 12 cassette tapes for just 1 shiny penny. The Columbia House penny deal was not just a scam. It was a rite of passage. You would see the ad in a magazine or tucked into a cereal box, 12 cassette tapes for 1 penny. 1 penny. You filled out the form like it was a lottery ticket, picking the albums that defined your soul. Bon Jovi, Whitney Houston, Def Leppard, even your weird cousin's favorite, Yanni. You mailed it off and waited like it was Christmas. A box showed up weeks later. Your collection exploded overnight. But then came the fine print. You were now subscribed. You had to buy more tapes at full price, regularly. And if you forgot to send back the postcard each month saying, "No thanks," they shipped one anyway. Surprise! You just bought a Kenny G album. Still, no one really cared. It felt good to game the system, even if the system gamed you back harder. You got to hold music in your hands. You built a soundtrack to your life, one mail-order package at a time. And when the music played, you danced. Or you spun. Or you raced downhill on a toy with no brakes, no helmet, and no plan. The sit and spin was a circular invitation to dizziness. You sat in the middle, gripped the plastic wheel, and turned yourself into a human tornado. It made you laugh. It made you sick. Sometimes both at once. It was pure joy with a side of nausea. Then there was the big wheel, bright red, impossibly low to the ground, with plastic wheels that screeched like banshees across the pavement. You could not steer it well. The handbrake did absolutely nothing. And that was the point. You raced down driveways, around cul-de-sacs, across sidewalks, knowing full well you had no control. And it felt amazing. It was your first taste of speed, of freedom, of danger wrapped in neon plastic. Kids today ride hoverboards and electric scooters. We had a hunk of plastic, our feet, and gravity. The bruises were badges. The spills were stories. And the commercials that convinced us to beg our parents for these toys? They came from a magical, overacted world where people said things like, "We'll be back to pick you up later." Mr. Microphone was ridiculous and unforgettable. A shiny wireless mic that let you broadcast your voice through any FM radio, turning your car into a karaoke machine and your bedroom into a concert hall. The ad featured a guy leaning out of a moving car, pointing the mic and yelling, "Hey, good looking! We'll be back to pick you up later." It was sleazy. It was funny. It was everywhere. And it worked. We believed that with the right gadget, you could become a star. Or at least really annoy your siblings. The 1980s were filled with weird inventions like this. Clackers, Snoopy snow cone makers, the Floby haircutting vacuum. These were not just toys. They were television promises. Late-night magic beamed into your living room, convincing you that life would be better, cooler, louder with just 4 easy payments. You circled the ads, begged your parents, and waited. Sometimes what arrived was junk, sometimes it was gold. But it always made you believe. And when Saturday finally came, you would spend your hard-earned allowance the only way that mattered, wandering the mall with your best friend, $5, and the whole day ahead. There was no better feeling than stepping into the mall with your best friend and $5 in your pocket. Not because it could buy much, but because it felt like it could buy everything. The air smelled like hot pretzels and hairspray. The soundtrack was a mix of Muzak and distant arcade beeping. You would start at the food court, maybe an Orange Julius or a soft-serve swirl, and then wander store to store like explorers with nowhere to be. Claire's had racks of glittery earrings, and you touched every single pair. Spencer's Gifts dared you to look at the back wall without giggling. The arcade swallowed your quarters one by one, but gave you blinking screens and plastic tickets in return. You were not shopping. You were living. The mall was a kingdom, and you were royalty. Free, untethered, and mildly unsupervised. You tried on sunglasses you could never afford, sprayed too much perfume, and laughed until your sides hurt. It was not about what you bought. It was about the day itself. And when school came Monday, you returned to your desk armed with memories and a pencil topped with something weird, squishy, or sparkly. Pencil toppers were not just decorations. They were conversation starters, status symbols, and tiny fidget toys rolled into one. You could not write a single sentence without squishing the eyeballs on your alien topper or spinning the tiny basketball on its hoop. Then there were the erasers, collectible, scented, shaped like food, animals, or cartoon blobs. They smelled like fruit, but erased like concrete. You never used them for their actual purpose. They lived in pencil cases, swapped hands in trades, and sat like trophies on desks. And then Lisa Frank came in like a glitter-drenched comet. Her world was all Technicolor dolphins, rainbow leopards, and flying unicorns with metallic manes. Every notebook, folder, and sticker sheet was an explosion of glitter and chaos. You were not just doing math, you were doing it in a world where a panda rode a skateboard across a galaxy of hearts. School supplies in the 1980s were not about learning. They were about being seen, about expressing yourself through colors too loud to ignore. And when the final bell rang, you would race home, drop your backpack, and do the next sacred task, become your family's human remote control. There was no remote. There was you. You had to get up, walk across the shag carpet, and turn the dial, slowly, carefully, hoping the knob did not fall off in your hand. There were only a handful of channels, but it felt like you were unlocking a vault every time you clicked from one to the next. And if your sibling was sitting closer, that was a fight waiting to happen. Turn it back! You missed it! You broke it. The television set was heavy, deep, and hummed with static like it was thinking. Sometimes you had to slap the side just to fix the picture. Other times you had to adjust the rabbit ears, twist the antenna, and pray to the signal gods. But it was yours. It filled the living room with laughter, drama, and commercials you still remember today. And when the screen finally faded to black for the night, you were left with silence, static, and the creeping voice of the after-school special that taught you drugs were bad and emotions were worse. After-school specials were the emotional sledgehammers of the 1980s. They aired just after the cartoons ended, when your guard was down and your snack was half-eaten. Titles like The Boy Who Drank Too Much or My Mom's Having a Baby hit you like surprise homework. They were corny. They were dramatic. But they were unforgettable. Every story had a troubled teen, a misunderstood parent, and a life lesson so heavy-handed it might as well have come with a brick. "I learned it by watching you, Dad," became a catchphrase burned into our brains by endless anti-drug ads. And who could forget the sizzling egg in a frying pan? This is your brain on drugs. Simple, violent, iconic. These specials meant well. They tried to teach us right from wrong, how to say no, and how to not get peer-pressured into a spiral of doom. But the real lesson was that television cared. It tried, even if it made you cringe. And if you needed a break from all that moral messaging, there was always a light bulb oven or a rubber bug kit waiting to turn your kitchen into a laboratory of sticky, sugary chaos. Light-bright, lit-up bedrooms in pixelated color. You would punch tiny plastic pegs through black paper templates, watching rainbows and unicorns glow to life under a single bulb. It was magic, and mildly dangerous. The pegs got lost in carpets, the templates tore, but you kept going, creating nighttime masterpieces, one color dot at a time. Then there was the Easy Bake Oven, a glorified lamp disguised as a kitchen appliance. You would mix powdered cake batter with tap water, pour it into a tiny metal tray, and wait 30 excruciating minutes for a cupcake the size of a postage stamp. It was never fully cooked. It was always delicious. The oven smelled like melted dreams and sugar. And creepy crawlers? That was the mad scientist's toolkit. Plastic molds, gooey liquids, and a heating tray turned your desk into a bug factory. You would make scorpions, worms, and unidentifiable critters in shocking neon colors. They were rubbery. They were gross. They were perfect. These toys taught you patience, creativity, and how to burn yourself carefully. And when you were done making creatures by the dozen, you went outside, climbed something too tall, and tested the limits of childhood physics. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school. Because chances were, everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture. It all added to the mood. You were not just watching. You were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. If your mom ever handed you a little green booklet and a stack of stamps at the grocery store, you already know where this is going. S&H Green Stamps were basically kid currency in the 1970s. Every purchase at participating stores earned you these tiny rectangular stamps. You would go home, sit at the kitchen table, and carefully lick and stick them into pages of a booklet like some kind of mini stockbroker. And the best part? You could buy things with them. Not just little trinkets either. We are talking about radios, toasters, blenders, even bikes if you had enough patience and pages. It was like unlocking treasure chests using grocery points. And moms? They took this seriously. There were strategies. They knew which stores gave out the best deals, and they would make the rounds like pros. For kids, it felt like a weird game of Monopoly, but real. Every filled booklet was a step closer to some magical reward catalog where you could flip through and dream big. You did not just shop, you invested. And if your family loved collecting things from everyday errands, you better believe gas stations were next in line to turn a pit stop into a treasure hunt. In the 1970s, if you lived out in the country and owned a tractor, you basically owned a car, a truck, and a parade float all in one. Tractors were not just for farms, they were the rural equivalent of a commuter vehicle. Need to get to the store? Take the tractor. Dropping by your neighbor's house 3 miles down a dirt road? Tractor again. There was no need for plates, registration, or insurance. The rules were simple. If it moved and it did not break anything, it was fair game. Authorities looked the other way because honestly, who was going to ticket the guy who also grew their corn? It was a slower time, and we mean that literally. You would see 20-mile-per-hour traffic jams with a full line of cars behind one of these beasts, and no one really minded. Today, you need plates, reflectors, and often a permit to drive a tractor even a block away from your land. But back then, tractors were as common on rural roads as pickup trucks, and a whole lot louder. That high-pitched tone, you remember it. You might even feel it in your chest right now. The emergency broadcast system test did not care what you were doing. It took over everything. You could be watching your favorite cartoon, a family sitcom, or a game show with flashing lights, and suddenly the screen would freeze, a gray static box would appear, and that bone-chilling noise would wail through the speakers. Then came the voice, always monotone, always distant. This is a test. This is only a test. Even though they told you it was just a drill, it still felt like the end of the world was knocking. You sat still, stared at the screen, and waited for it to go away. Some kids covered their ears, others ran to find a parent. It was spooky in a way you could not explain. You did not know what nuclear war was, not really, but you knew this test meant something big, something adult, something terrifying. After a minute or two, it would vanish, and the show would come back on like nothing happened. But you felt different. That noise lived in your bones. Still, once the fear passed, you went back to being a kid. And in the 1970s, being a kid meant making your own fun, sometimes by putting on a show right in your backyard. Commercial jingles in the 1980s were not just background noise, they were the soundtrack of your childhood. Short, catchy, and borderline hypnotic. From "I do not want to grow up, I am a Toys R Us kid" to my buddy, wherever I go, he goes." These little songs became national earworms. You knew the tune before you even understood the product. And even now, decades later, you probably remember all the lyrics without trying. Fast food chains, toys, theme songs for cereal, they all knew how to brand themselves right into your brain. And we loved it. These were not just ads. They were pop culture. Kids would sing them on the playground like they were chart-topping hits. Some even had dance routines. And the best ones? They felt like a little burst of joy in between the shows you came to watch. It was marketing, sure, but it was also magic. A 30-second clip that made you beg your parents for action figures, Happy Meals, or the latest sugary snack with a weird mascot. And yes, even today, if you hear the opening note of gimme a break," you know exactly what is coming. But when it came to making your own mix of hits, that required serious patience and a strong dislike for chatty radio DJs. Get this, in the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Making a mixtape in the 1980s was not just about the music, it was about what the music meant. This was not a playlist you could throw together in 5 minutes. This was a curated collection of feelings, carefully selected for maximum emotional impact. Every track had a purpose. Every order was intentional. You did not just make mixtapes for yourself. You made them for friends, for crushes, for breakups, for birthdays, for sitting in your room, staring at the ceiling, thinking deep thoughts you had no business thinking at that age. You would spend hours hitting pause and record, rewinding to check the transition, trying to fit exactly the right number of songs on each side without cutting one off too soon. There was a science to it, a rhythm, a philosophy, and then came the cover art. Doodles, stickers, fake band logos, scribbled lyrics, little hearts and broken hearts. The label on a mixtape said everything about who you were or who you wanted to be. These tapes were gifts, time capsules, emotional resumes. You gave one to someone and it meant something. It meant a lot. But if you did not have the patience or just wanted to cheat the system a little, you could always get a dozen albums for the price of a gumball. Almost. Paper routes were the ultimate crash course in growing up. It was not just a side gig. It was a rite of passage. You would get up before the sun, sometimes before your parents were even awake, pull on your jacket, and head out with that thick canvas shoulder bag that nearly dragged on the ground. The newspapers were heavy, especially on Sundays. You would roll and rubber band them the night before or as you went, if you were brave. There was a rhythm to it. Walking house to house, tossing them just right so they landed near the door but not in the bushes. You knew which neighbors tipped, which ones complained, and which ones pretended they were not home when it came time to collect. And that was the part no one warned you about, the collection. You had to knock on doors, smile politely, and ask for your money. It was awkward. It was humbling. But it made you feel grown. You earned something. And if you saved up enough, you could finally buy that thing you had been eyeing for months. A new bike, a radio, or maybe a toy. But not just any toy. We are talking about the weirdest, creepiest, most unforgettable toy of the era. One with disguises, glue-on features, and a face you could never forget. Let's talk about Hugo, man of 1,000 faces. If you wanted to feel indestructible in the 1970s, you bought a retired checker cab and drove it like your own private limousine. These things were built like bunkers. Steel frames, giant bench seats, enough legroom to host a yoga class. They were meant to haul passengers all day, every day, and because of that, they could take an unbelievable beating. When cities started retiring their fleets, the used cabs hit the market for dirt cheap, and everyday people scooped them up like hotcakes. You could legally register one as a personal vehicle, no questions asked. It was not unusual to see a checker cab parked in a suburban driveway, its faded yellow paint barely covered by an amateur paint job. They were impossible to miss and nearly impossible to wreck. Safety standards? They were considered built-in by sheer size and weight. Of course, they guzzled gas like nobody's business and cornered like a refrigerator on wheels, but hey, that was a small price to pay for invincibility. Eventually, they disappeared, retired for good. And speaking of unusual rides, let us not forget about the street-legal tuk-tuks and rickshaws that once rolled through American tourist towns like they belonged there. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. You knew a toy was unforgettable when it lingered in your dreams, or maybe your nightmares. Hugo, man of 1,000 faces, was that toy. It was not soft or cuddly. It was a bald, plastic, mannequin-style head with eyes that seemed a little too real. And you could change its face. No, really. You got this kit full of rubbery noses, scars, mustaches, eyebrows, eye patches, and even glasses to transform Hugo into anything from a movie villain to a Cold War spy. You applied the features with a kind of glue stick that felt halfway between a craft tool and something out of a mad scientist's lab. This was not a toy you brought to bed with you. It was one you studied, experimented with, maybe even tried to prank your sibling with. There was something fascinating and just a bit unsettling about it. And yet, you kept going back to it. You made stories around those disguises, invented entire secret agent missions with Hugo at the center. Back in the 1970s, your imagination did most of the heavy lifting. That was the magic. And if you really wanted to get creative, especially in October, you did not go to the store for a costume. You went to the kitchen junk drawer, the recycling bin, and maybe the attic. Yes, you read that right. Riding lawnmowers were not just for cutting grass, they were for visiting neighbors, hitting the local store, and sometimes even school drop-offs. In smaller towns, you could hop on your mower and putter right into town, past houses, dogs, and the occasional confused police officer. Nobody batted an eye. It was slow, it was loud, and it was very much not road safe, but it was legal. You did not need registration or a license, and in some places, people just threw a flag on the back and called it good. The lawnmower became an unlikely local legend. You might pass 3 of them parked at the general store like horses at a saloon. People waved like it was completely normal because, well, it was. It was practical and resourceful, and honestly, pretty charming. Today, cities and counties have all kinds of rules about non-standard vehicles on public roads. Most riding mowers now are strictly yard-bound unless you want a ticket and a lecture. But in the 1970s, nobody had time for that. If it moved and did not catch fire, it was transportation. Speaking of creative transportation, the next thing might blow your mind, because you could legally build a car in your garage from scratch and still register it for the road. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. Saturday mornings in the 1970s were sacred. You did not sleep in. You woke up early, grabbed the biggest bowl you could find, filled it with sugary cereal, and plopped down in front of the television. This was not just a casual routine. It was a ritual. You only had a few golden hours before the grown-up programs kicked in, and every second counted. The lineup? Legendary. Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, the Super Friends, the Jetsons. But nestled between the slapstick and sound effects were something sneakier. Public service announcements. You would be watching Bugs Bunny one minute, and the next, a little cartoon light bulb wearing sneakers would hop on screen singing, "I'm just a Bill." Suddenly, you were learning about how laws were made and the importance of brushing your teeth, all while still chewing on marshmallow shapes. And somehow, it worked. Time for Timer told you about cheese and crackers. Schoolhouse Rock gave you grammar. These messages were as much a part of your childhood as the shows themselves. They blended right into the backdrop of your Saturday, like static in between the channels. You did not always understand them, but you remembered them. And as soon as you heard the first jingle in the distance, the real fun began. Because there was something coming that could get every kid off the couch in seconds. Back in the 1970s, monster trucks were not just something you saw at arena shows. They were rolling through neighborhoods like local legends. Drivers would lift their trucks sky high with no thought to rollover danger, center of gravity, or whether they could actually park the thing in their own driveway. Tires the size of bathtubs? Absolutely. No visible license plate? Who was looking? There were no limits to how high you could lift your suspension or how ridiculous your truck looked. If you needed a ladder to get in, you were doing it right. Police officers rarely pulled them over because, honestly, it was not even illegal yet. No one was worried about crash test ratings or pedestrian safety zones, and the idea of stability control was still hanging out in a notebook somewhere in Detroit. Today, height restrictions and suspension laws make sure your ride does not double as a climbing wall. But back then, the bigger the better, and the louder, the cooler. Speaking of things that would make today's DMV faint, let us talk about tractors. Yes, actual tractors, cruising down country roads without plates or papers. Halloween in the 1970s was not a trip to a pop-up shop for a $30 superhero suit. It was a challenge, a test of creativity, a race to see who could turn a cardboard box and some tinfoil into a full-blown astronaut helmet or a robot torso. You begged your parents for old clothes, rummaged through closets for anything with a weird texture, and repurposed kitchen utensils into alien antennas. And then there were the masks. You know the ones. Thin plastic with elastic bands that snapped after 2 wears, tiny eye holes that never lined up with your face, and a mouth slit so small you could not breathe without fogging up the inside. But still, when it came time to trick or treat, you felt invincible. You became someone else. There was pride in a homemade costume. Nobody else on the block had it. You made it, with your own hands, or with your parents' help after dinner. And if your costume got torn or the rain made the paint run, you just kept going. Candy was candy, rain or shine, store-bought or not. But if you really wanted to earn something sweet, and not just from a pillowcase haul, you had to do a little hustling of your own. That meant going door to door, not for candy, but for glass bottles. Public service announcements in the 1980s were something else. You would be watching cartoons or a sitcom, then suddenly, boom. The screen would cut to a gray filter, eerie music, and a serious voice saying, "This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs." Or a crash dummy flying through a windshield, or a puppet warning you not to talk to strangers. They were dramatic, unsettling, and weirdly unforgettable. One minute you were giggling at Garfield. The next you were wondering if touching a light socket would make you disappear forever. These announcements were designed to scare you straight. And they worked. They haunted your dreams and followed you into adulthood. Some used animation. Some used real actors with tear-streaked cheeks and slow zooms. And all of them felt like they were speaking directly to you. But even with the ominous tones, there was something strangely comforting about them. Like the world was trying to look out for you, even if it scared you a little. They were a strange part of growing up, and honestly, we would be lying if we said we did not remember them word for word. Still, if there was one thing that really balanced it all out, it was the glory of waking up at sunrise for the lineup of legends. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered mini bike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. Taping songs off the radio was a sacred mission. You would sit for hours next to your boombox, finger hovering over the record button, praying that the next song would be the one. And when it was, you had one shot to catch it clean, no static, no interruptions, and above all, no DJ talking over the intro. But of course, they always did. The opening notes would hit, your heart would race, and just as you hit record, that was the latest from Madonna. Coming up next, we've got... And just like that, your perfect mixtape moment was ruined. You would yell at the radio like the DJ could hear you. Why? Why do you do this to me? It was a battle of timing and nerves. Some kids got sneaky and recorded during the night shift when the hosts were quieter. Others became masters of timing, predicting when the chorus would drop, when the ad break would hit. It took real skill. And even if you missed a few seconds of the intro, you still labeled the tape like it was gold. You were not just building a playlist, you were capturing a moment. Free music, sure, but earned through effort, patience, and pure willpower. And if you were serious about your song collection, you were not stopping at one track. You were building an entire soundscape, one emotional banger at a time. Choppers in the 1970s were not just bikes, they were statements, and the louder and longer the fork, the bolder the message. You would see motorcycles with 6-foot extended forks cruising down the highway like something out of a comic book. These things had no front brakes, almost no suspension, and about as much handling control as a brick on roller skates. But nobody cared. They looked cool. And back then, looking cool was more important than stopping safely. Builders would chop down factory models, stretch out the frames, and slap on as much chrome as humanly possible. The longer it looked, the better. Riding one meant you had guts, or just no fear of potholes. Amazingly, these were all street legal. You could register a motorcycle with modifications that today would not make it past a parking lot inspection. There were no federal mandates on motorcycle geometry or braking systems. If it ran, it rode. Eventually, the law caught up, and these extreme builds got shut down by new regulations. But at the time, choppers were everywhere, from biker rallies to small-town roads, rolling art with no regard for physics. If you think that sounds wild, wait until you picture someone doing their weekly grocery run on a riding lawnmower. If there was ever a book that made kids believe in magic, it was the Sears Christmas Wish book. Thick, glossy, and practically glowing with possibility, it dropped into your mailbox like a brick of joy every fall. You did not read it, you devoured it. The toy section alone could occupy an afternoon. You would flip through each page slowly, pen in hand, circling dreams like you were planning a heist. Bikes, action figures, dolls with blinking eyes, remote control cars the size of shoeboxes. It was all in there. You would fold corners, make notes, maybe even leave it open to the exact page your heart was set on and hope your parents noticed. This was not just a catalog. It was a seasonal ritual. The pages felt endless. Even if you never got the big-ticket items, it did not matter. Half the fun was imagining what you could get. And if you had siblings, you better believe there were rules about who got to look at it first. Some houses had it down to a science. A few minutes each, no hogging. But all that joy had a flip side. Because nothing could snap you out of toy-filled daydreams quite like a certain buzzing sound from the television, the kind that made your heart drop even if you did not know why. Somewhere along the way, we traded in joy for convenience and barely noticed. Drop your favorite forgotten memory in the comments. And if this hit home, like, subscribe, and pass it on.